Welcome to the Augmented Intelligence Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Haroun, the co-founder and CEO of Eudia. I'm really, really excited to have Rob Beard joining us today. Rob has an awesome career and personal story, which we're going to get into, and really an inspiring vision for the legal industry. So I'll turn it over to you, Rob, and I'd love to maybe start with a little bit more about your story. What are some maybe personal parts of it that are a little bit less well-known, don't show up on a LinkedIn bio that kind of make you who you are?
Well, thanks, Omar, for having me. It's good to be here with you today and talking with you. Appreciate it. I think I can't imagine my story is very interesting to anyone, actually. My LinkedIn stuff is the most exciting thing about me. I think maybe just worth mentioning. I am probably less of your expected sort of GC or chief legal officer. I started my career in politics, worked in politics for a number of years before going to law school, and went to law school and had a whole different sort of plan for my career than where I ended up. But I learned that I really love doing deals. I got a cool opportunity out of law school to go after I clerked to go work in London, and I took that not necessarily because I wanted to do capital markets deals or M&A deals or anything like that. I thought, cool, it'd be cool to live in London. And I grew up in this in a very sort of sheltered childhood where I didn't get out very much. My first time going east of Denver was when I served an LDS mission in Chicago when I was 19 years old. So prior to that, I literally had never been east of Denver. Only my second time on an airplane, even when I was 19 years old. So, I had very different plans for what I was going to do with my career. But I was so excited to go live in London and experience living outside the U.S. and how cool that would be. And it was that really helped me create and learn to love deals. I learned to love doing deals, and I loved not just the legal aspect of doing deals that most lawyers get into, like the purchase agreement, writing the offering memorandum, whatever. But I was really excited about making deals. And it's that making deals that took me from leaving a law firm environment to going in-house, because I wanted to get closer to the making of the deals, part of the story. And so I guess from my perspective, I have a very keen appreciation for the work that goes into making a deal happen, from the corporate development team and the integration team and all those types of people, and the lawyers as well. But I started thinking early on as I was doing those deals about various things that were part of doing those transactions, where we were using a really high-priced lawyer to do something that to me was sort of like almost kind of shocking, right? Like, we're doing this thing, or a very expensive second-year lawyer was doing this thing where not only were they expensive, but they didn't really know enough to add a lot of value. And I remember thinking, like, man, I can't believe people pay $600 an hour for this person that, but they were paying it because you were a big law firm and they had the backing of the big law firm and the partners and all this sort of thing. And so, but it got me thinking, like, there are various pieces of this thing that kind of don't make sense, right? That these big deals, there's value in the partner who understands, or the person who's seen a lot of deals and understand how deals can go, or can help you churn your way through a challenge, help you solve a problem. But there's other parts of that deal that need to be done, that are done a million times and are kind of commoditized. Yet you're still relying on the same type of person, or a person like that in embryo, to do this other part of the deal that maybe isn't that exciting, I guess, or that unique.
Yeah. And how do you think we ended up in that situation where you have this system where you're paying hundreds of dollars an hour for work that arguably is, should be automated, or now that it can be automated, should be automated? I mean, what's driving that system?
Well, I think you got to go back to before things could be automated, right? And this all sort of developed before things could be automated. And I remember, so I joined a law firm in it would have been 2009, 2010 when I joined. I was a young associate that age. not so long after a couple big rounds of layoffs to law firms. You think about like the way law firms grew up, late 90s, late 90s, especially during here in Silicon Valley during sort of that IPO boom. These law firms grow up and they've got tons of like administrative support staff. And at the time, I think a lot of the firms were using the administrative support staff to do administrative things, right? Then you get into a downturn and the law firms lay off the administrative support staff. And what do? That work still has to get done. But now they have like the young associates do that work. And oh my gosh, instead of, billing out like $50 an hour, we could bill out $300 an hour because the junior associates. So like sort of the law firm model almost encouraged that. And by the time I started at a law firm, it was 3 or 4 associates to 1 assistant, no paralegals, nothing like that. And so I, as a junior lawyer, was doing a ton of administrative work, and that was billable work, and I was billing for it, and clients were paying for it, right? So it's not so much as it was. I don't know that anybody really sat down and said like, this is a great way to do this work, but it was sort of more of like, hey, we had a downturn, we lay off people, we lay off some of the administrative people, we have the lawyers do that work the administrative people were previously doing. And it was sort of like this perverse incentive because now you have junior lawyers doing the same thing that you had assistants doing before or paralegals doing before, and you can actually bill more, right? You can bill $300 an hour for somebody to do copies. You can bill $300 an hour for somebody to like paste through red lines or to take a markup and that was handwritten by a partner and plug it into the computer, right? That previously would have been done maybe by a paralegal or an assistant type person at a much lower cost. So I don't think it was really by design or intentional, but sort of accidental that we got to the place where we have junior lawyers doing a lot of what I would say is pretty administrative or menial type work. And it's really, really repetitive, right? It's stuff that you do over and over and over again where there's going to law school it makes no bearing on whether you do it better than the next person. As a matter of fact, sometimes you do it worse than the next person. But you're there and you can do it and the clients will pay for it. And so that's sort of what ends up happening.
Yeah. And so there's one beneficiary of this whole thing, which is
yeah.
Yeah. Basically the traditional law firm model or traditional law firms.
Although I will say, I don't know that I would necessarily even call it traditional. I think it's sort of the last 20 years worth of law firms, right? If you go back 50 years to law firms, nobody was going to law school and going to a big law firm thinking like, I'm going to spend the first 3 or 4 years taking partners' markups and being a word processing person, right? Like, but that's what it became. But I think if you think about really what is a traditional law firm, the old line sort of law firm, that was more of you're an apprenticeship and then doing really high value work, advising, that kind of thing. And I think as we think about what technology is capable of doing today, one of the things I think about a lot is has a potential to return us to that kind of a setup where lawyers are doing more advising, strategic work, in the in-house world, sort of being business partners that understand the law rather than doing some of these tasks that are repetitive or not super. They're value add in the sense that they make things go, but they're not value add in the sense that they're unique and, sort of interesting or bespoke in any type of way.
I love it. Yeah, no, I think it's a really profound insight. It's almost like post-internet technology's kind of gotten us into this mess where
To some degree.
Suddenly there's an explosion of data. Law firms become a $400 billion industry, and largely because a huge amount of that work is suddenly on the table and they can get away with having high billed people. And now if technology got us into this mess, technology's probably going that'll get us out of this mess.
Well, and you think about too, technology, litigation space isn't necessarily my space, although as a GC, you learn to know it. But think about sort of litigation and M&A context for a second. A huge portion of the bills that are generated in those types of transactions or types of setups are to review documents, right? So technology has allowed us to create all these documents that then in a litigation scenario need to be reviewed, right? Same thing in an M&A scenario. You're going buying a company. Now the company is now generated. There's all these documents that are available and they're electronic, and somebody's got to go look at all the contracts and make sure that all the contracts work for the company that's doing the acquisition, so there's a proliferation of data that has exploded over the last 20 years as a result of technology enabling data to be created, and that results in then higher transaction costs on a deal side or higher sort of costs on the litigation side. It may improve outcomes too, right? I tend to believe that more data is better and helps you make better decisions, provided that you're able to intake that data and make it it's actionable for you. But it certainly has created more, technology's created more information that's available in those settings. I'm not 100% convinced that even with the way that we're doing deals or the way we're doing litigation matters today, I'm not sure that we're like taking advantage of that data in the best way we can. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but there's so much data at every company that exists at the company that is never used, right? Never exploited, never available, because it's too costly to access and to glean insights from.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. Before getting to that, I'd love to hear a little bit about from your perspective. I mean, I still remember when we first met and connected, what that conversation was like. I'd love to hear, kind of from your perspective, what that memory is.
Yeah, sure. So, I became General Counsel of Micron. I'd become General Counsel of Micron a couple years before you and I first met. And part of what I was promoted internally at Micron. I joined Micron as a deal lawyer and grew up at the company and was there for about 10 years. And as I became the General Counsel, one of the things that I talked about along that path was sort of this vision that I had for what an in-house legal team could be. And that vision that I had for what an in-house legal team could be is a group of people that does things and creates outputs from those things that then shares those things with each other, with the team across the organization, and over time creates a body of work that becomes sort of the brain of that organization, the brain of that legal organization. And rather than reinventing the wheel every time, one of the things that would drive me crazy, I'd have people come to me like in the procurement team and say, I really like lawyer A because I get done faster with lawyer A and I get done with lawyer B. But, lawyer A and lawyer B are like actually negotiating different deals on the same, give them the same subject matter, they'll negotiate a different deal because we didn't yet have like our way of doing things. Mm-hmm. And even if we did have our way of doing things, to have our way informed by like what works for us in the past, how we've been able to execute well in the past, thinking about like this dynamic sort of playbook that always learns and grows based on what our experience is. We didn't have any of that. So, my vision for the future was being able to have this thing, this brain, this central place where every time we do anything, we could go into that and ask questions, query it about whatever we were working on, and we would get back an answer that was unique to our way of doing things and based on our experiences.
Right.
And I've been thinking about that for a long time. Like, how can I create that in this organization? Sure, there's a sort of a cost savings part of it, right? Because we wouldn't have to go to outside counsel all the time if we were. Sometimes, like literally, law firms or companies will ask different law firms the same question like many times over the course of many years, each at $1,500 an hour, right? But how could we get all of that, use it, keep it dynamic, and train everybody in the organization to go here first, get your answer, and then validate it? And then I met you. And I always felt like this idea was something that technology would ultimately solve, that it wasn't, I was focused very much on putting systems and processes into place to structure our data, to do the things that I felt like were precursors to the creation of this thing. And then you and I started talking, maybe must have been about 6 months after ChatGPT, which I view as sort of like an inflection point in the world, where after ChatGPT became well known and people started playing around with it and using it on a regular basis. And so you and I, it was you and me, and then later you and me and Ashish and David, and we started talking about the company that you were, the technology you had, the company you were forming, and what you might want to do with that company. And I think you told me you were going to do. I think you told me you were thinking about looking at what were you
litigation, and
those litigations like doc review and stuff
yeah,
like that, right? And I said, that's cool. That's very useful. But I felt like there were people out there sort of doing that, and it was kind of being done reasonably well. But your approach that you were talking about, which we didn't really define at the time, but later we sort of defined as an AI agent type approach. I felt like what you were talking about could be the thing that would over time create the brain that I was talking about. And what at the time we were talking about, it was Micron still, I think. But I used to tell my lawyers, if you're sitting in Singapore and you work for Micron, you don't practice Micron, or you don't practice Singapore law, you practice Micron law, our way of doing things, informed by Singapore law, informed by your experience. And so this was creating that embodiment of the Micron law, and then it became MasterCard law. And I felt like your approach was actually the thing. Your technology and the way that you were thinking about it was the thing that could bring that vision to life. And so I remember we had this conversation. I encouraged you. I said, I would start somewhere else. I think we first started talking about contracts and the way that we could glean information from contracts that the company had already done to help inform future negotiations and things like that. And I remember we had this conversation, and I remember two key parts of it. Number one, I said, if you really want to succeed, don't go build something and then try to sell it to everybody, because that's what all the legal tech people do. They build something and it works in in sterile environment, right? And then you try to bring it into your organization, and it's really hard to get it to work. And you have to have the change management is hard, and the implementation is hard, and you have to, every in-house legal team needs to work with AI or needs to work with their IT team to implement those things, but they're low on the priority list for the IT team of the company because their spend isn't high enough. And so then they try to hire their own people and do their own IT change management, and it never works really well either. And so in theory, you've got a great product that works in a certain environment, but doesn't work in every environment, or maybe really any real environment, right? And so I remember telling you, if you can get patient investors who will help you, who you can help see that if you did this more bottoms up instead, and you worked with a few companies to really understand their systems and process and the way they work and their pain points, and find their repetitive processes and help them use an AI agent. We weren't calling it that at the time, but use an AI agent to go and execute those processes. That would be something that would be really, really interesting. And then the second thing I remember telling you was, please go talk to a few other general counsels, because I may be crazy and I don't want to steer you in this direction and steer your investors in this direction if I'm wrong. And so I suggested you go out and talk to a few other people before you started executing on this, just to make sure.
Absolutely. No, and really, I mean, you changed our trajectory, and we did talk to a few other general counsels, and I think one of the most interesting findings was just how there was this great opportunity. I think when you talk about Micron law or MasterCard law or now Coherent law, it may not fully, in that very shorthand, describe the power of it, because one thing that you really helped me understand and helped us understand, I think helping the industry understand, is that in-house lawyers are just very, very different than law firm lawyers. Not, I mean, frankly, it's often the same people who go from one to the other, but the mentality, I think the term you taught me and that I still remember was, it's more like a business person who happens to understand the law and navigate the law than a lawyer who's applying
certainly
kind of legal judgment. So I think kind of one thing that was really interesting when we did talk to other general counsels was with not just contracts, but with a lot of areas and even litigation when viewed from a different lens, when you're thinking about it as, how can I not only codify what our law is, but also go in with a lens of how can we use AI to add value to the business first and foremost. And of course, also make sure that we're doing everything in a legal and compliant way. It's a really, really different way of thinking. And I think we've kind of seen that, and maybe you can share some examples of where, you sort of saw augmented intelligence in action and what that looked like.
Yeah. And we talk about, talking about augmented intelligence, right? I mean, right now you're working with me at Coherent on creating our legal team of the future. And we call that project Iron Man. And I chose Iron Man for a reason, because I want the lawyers who are involved to understand what we're talking about doing. And what we're talking about doing is effectively a lawyer going to their job every day and putting on the Iron Man suit and being augmented by your technology the same way, Tony Stark was augmented by the Iron Man technology, right? The Iron Man suit technology and Jarvis and all of those things. And that's really the way that I think about the future of the legal team is it's not that lawyers are being replaced or they're less valuable or anything like that. They're more valuable because they have these tools that they can deploy to give them information, to give them insights, and give them time to go be the strategic partner to the business that they should be, and or they would ideally be, right? And I think most people who go into a corporate legal environment, they don't go into that environment because they want to draft 1 million contracts a year or because they want to look at the same red line over and over again. They go because they want to help add value to the business. Yet the way that it works today, we've allowed ourselves to sort of, I say a lot of times, we've allowed ourselves to become devalued and become sort of document machines or other similar types of roles. And frankly, I would like to see my lawyers never doing the same thing twice. If it's repeatable, I say I want the machines to do it, right? If it's repeatable, the machines should be doing it. So a few of those examples. So first, when I was at MasterCard, you and I worked on a pilot program where we were working on some acquisitions. MasterCard is a very acquisitive company. And we would outsource those acquisitions, generally speaking, to outside counsel. And one of the areas where we have a lot of spend in every acquisition was the due diligence process, related to the transaction. And due diligence is a big process, and there's several different components of it. One of the components of it is a review of all the contracts that go into the data room. So you start an M&A deal, you tell the target, give them a list. And it's give me all the contracts that you have, essentially, right? I want to review all the contracts and make sure there's nothing crazy in them and make sure we can incorporate them into our environment and there's no sort of really challenging provisions. They're going to act as something that might stop the deal, for example. No poison pills, those sorts of things. And the way that most legal teams in-house do that is they give an instruction to their outside counsel. So they tell the target, please they give them a list. Say, please give all your contracts responsive to this list. Put them in a box, put them in Dropbox or whatever it is. Put them there, and then we tell the outside counsel, please go review and summarize all of those contracts. We're actually not asking, in most cases, they're not asking the outside counsel, tell us what they mean or how they affect our business or anything. Just give us a summary, 1 page, half page, whatever. You spend a lot of money on those summaries. And what you and I talked about was something that we felt like an AI agent could do. And it's a bit of it was a bit of a journey for us to get to that point. One of the challenges that I think a lot of lawyers that are in-house, a lot of people in my position face is getting people over the hurdle that it's okay to use AI in the company and getting through the DPAs and all the different IT requirements and stuff like that. And we were struggling with that at MasterCard, which had a pretty complex bureaucracy. But we really wanted to get a proof of concept done to show people. And I think that's the key is we got to show people what this can do. I think a lot of people, when they think about using AI in the law, they're thinking about two computers negotiating a deal against each other. I don't want that. And I don't think that's going to work. But what we can do is we can have the computers give us the information to go negotiate a deal with somebody else, right? So we have to show people what AI can do, and that's what we did here. And we found a path that was less resistant than other paths by using somebody else's data, right? So the data was going into a box. Target put their data into a box. They had agreed with us that we could use our advisors could review that information as part of the due diligence process. And so what we did is we pitted you against a law firm, gave the same instructions to you in a law firm, said, please summarize these contracts for us. And we got our summaries back from you, and we got our summaries back from the law firm and compared the results to each other. And there were a couple really unique insights in that process for me. The first was you guys were better. At the actual task assigned, the AI agents were better. We got it done a lot faster. The result was consistent, and you gave us more information in terms of the way that you structured things and cross references and links to things and stuff like that the law firms never gave us. Law firms just give us an analysis. Ours did just give us analysis. But what was really interesting is when I asked my team to compare yours, and this wasn't blind, compare your result to the law firm's result, what came back was sort of well, it's okay, but all they did is really just summarize the contracts for us. And so, well, what was the instruction? It was summarize the contracts. So, well, what's the problem then with the instruction? Well, what we'd really like is, and I said, well, why don't you ask them to do that next thing, right? And the next thing was more to give us more insights about what really mattered to us, and then which are the ones that we should focus on. What are the provisions we should really be looking at, because we care about these several things. You actually don't normally ask the law firms to do that because what first or second year associate who's doing your summaries of contracts, they don't know enough about your business. They don't know enough about business most of the time to be able to give you those kinds of insights. But the AI agent that we were able to train about the things we cared about was able to do that. So we were actually able to go a step beyond even what the law firm could give us at a much lower price and a much faster turnaround time.
Yeah, and I think I remember one of the examples of that was you or one of the people on your team mentioned, hey, what we're really curious about is if this target's working with any of our competitors. And that was, once we understood that, it was like a relatively quick, maybe a couple hour process for us to be able to highlight that and generate a report.
And so what's really interesting about that is you normally ask, I think two reasons why you don't normally ask the law firms to that. Number one, like to give them a big list of things to look at. Like you're not sure you're going to get consistent results. It's a lot of work for associates to do it. It ups the cost. So that's number one. But then number two, I think sometimes we didn't think about this until after this was done. Now we're not going to have them go all the way back through it because that's very expensive. But for us, actually, it was even better because we were able to build on our previous work. And that's, I think, a big difference between the way that we use an AI agent versus the way that we might use outside counsel or a shared services team or something like that is you don't always have to think of everything up front anymore. You can get the result back and be like, I have a new thought. Let's go look at this. And it's like minutes, right?
Yeah.
Versus hours.
Yeah. And this may be a stretch. I don't know, be accused of revisionist history or anything, but I almost wonder if when we have a task like that, regardless of what kind of a organization you're running, if you were told, hey, there's a data room with 500 contracts, the clock's ticking, please summarize all of these manually, you're like off to the races. You don't have time to think about anything else. You just have to get that task done. If you have an augmented AI agent and you can now get that done very quickly, I remember it kind of allowed us to start asking each other and internally, why are we even doing the summary in the first place? And I think one thing that I find fascinating about the work with you in particular, but other customers too, is it's like we're all, I think, jumping the gun now that AI is here. Everyone's diving in who has an interest in it without asking some of those more fundamental questions. But you think about, even something as simple as a red line. What is a red line? What's the purpose of a red line, right? It's really a assessment of risk and a proposed mitigation to that risk. Okay, well, how do you assess risk and how should you assess risk? And maybe there's an opportunity now, and I think some of the work that we're starting to do together hits on some of these more foundational questions, which lawyers are very well suited to do. It's not repeatable work. It's highly strategic, complex work that requires juggling a lot of business interests, regulatory, legal. So yeah, I think that's definitely was a big part of that POC. I think it was really illustrated many things kind of beyond just that one task.
Yeah, and I've been really focused thus far because I view all of this as a roadmap and bringing people along. The technology is there today to do everything you could possibly imagine doing with AI in a legal setting. It is. I'm convinced of that. I've seen it work. I know that it is. But the big challenge is getting people to implementing it well, and feeling comfortable with what you've implemented and how you might use it. And I've been so focused on, hey, let's just use an AI agent to do the same thing we're asking outside counsel to do or asking a shared services team to do. But you're right. I think ultimately, as we go through this process of building out our roadmaps and figuring out what we could have AI agents do and do well, we're trying to ask ourselves, is this the right question to be asking? Why are we asking this question? Going back to that proof of concept we did on the M&A due diligence, we asked you the same question that we asked the outside counsel. We asked the outside counsel that question because we thought that's all they can do.
Mhm.
And so we were actually limiting ourselves in a couple ways. We were limiting ourselves in cost, right? We don't want to spend them too much on this thing, but we were also limiting ourselves in sort of like, who's doing this work for us at the outside counsel? What do they know? What are they capable of doing? And the reality is, when you're talking about like searching and summarizing and stuff like that, the machines are way better at it than the humans are. And so for various reasons. And so really it helps, I think, us open our eyes a little bit around what are we capable of doing with better information that we can get through these kind of approaches
Mhm.
versus the way they've done in the past.
Okay, so you talked about M&A DD. What are some other
Yeah.
use cases?
So I mean, the first one you and I talked about, when I was at Micron, we were going and negotiating a deal to sell, I don't know, NAND or maybe SSDs or something to a big enterprise customer, and it was a very big company who was used to getting all the terms the way that they wanted, and what they wanted from us was uncapped limitation of liability, and they were insisting on it, and they're saying other people gave it to them. And so the what was effectively a chief business officer of the company came to me and said, "Hey, this is the deal that's in front of us. I'd like to assess this deal as compared to other deals we've done and kind of understand like how much risk are we taking on? What's the largest limitation of liability we've ever given? And then what is that largest limitation of liability against the business opportunity that we foresaw at the time, and then also the business that we actually ended up getting?" Some pretty fundamental, really interesting questions that would be really valuable to have when you're negotiating a deal. So at Micron, we had just implemented, not that long prior to that, a CLM, contract lifecycle management tool. And we were very excited about our contract lifecycle management tool, and I was very excited about this. So I said, okay, team, this is great. Let's use our contract lifecycle management tool. Let's answer these questions. Tell me what the answers are. And it turns out we couldn't at all, because we hadn't coded some of those things in. Some of those questions that I just asked, we hadn't coded in when we input the contracts into the CLM. And that's one way that CLM is limiting, right? If you don't code it when you enter it, then you can't search by it later. The tag isn't there. So that was number one. Number two, we weren't even sure we actually had all the contracts in the CLM yet. And then sort of number three, we're concerned about sort of data fidelity. And so we said, okay, we might be able to answer this question if we hired a bunch of Axiom lawyers, and we caught and they've sort of put together a proposal for me, which was like a couple weeks and several $100,000. We could answer this question. Well, by the time we could do that, actually by the time they gave me the proposal, the negotiation was over. I had failed as the chief legal officer to support the business and advise the business on the right deal terms to go do a deal. And this CLM implementation that we'd spent millions of dollars on, to me, kind of felt like a little bit of a waste.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was feeling that very acutely when you and I first started talking, because I thought, what if instead I had a tool that could just crawl over every contract, find all the contracts in our systems, crawl over all of them, and give me that answer in a day. And I know since then you've developed that similar questions for lots of people, answered similar questions for lots of people, not in a day, but in minutes.
Yeah.
I really envision a future where my lawyers go into negotiations on deals, on procurement matters, on sales matters, on other types of things with that kind of information. And I was actually just talking with someone about this yesterday. Today, I'm thinking about, what are the questions that we would want to ask? Having a tool that the day before a negotiation or whatever, we could ask all those questions of our AI agent and we get answers, and then we could go into the negotiation. But it's even better than that, right? We could actually train our AI agent that every time a calendar invite popped up on our Outlook calendars, it would go out and get all that information for us and stick it on the calendar invite, so the night before I could go review it. I wouldn't even have to ask. Those are the types of things that I think that can make lawyers much, much, much more valuable than we are today, because today most lawyers don't have that kind of information. And so when we go and advise a business partner on something like a limitation of liability in a contract, we're fighting over what we believe the world should look like and what we think is the right answer, but it's often without a lot of data. It's often not in context of the broader business and the business opportunities that are available, right? But it's also, and we haven't even really scratched the surface of this, it also isn't informed by what's actually happened, right? And I think that's also really important too. Like, if you're going back to the Micron example, if you're selling SSDs, like I don't actually know how, it's in the company's system somewhere, but I don't actually know like what damages have actually resulted from failed SSDs in the past, right? For example, but it's in there. It's just sort of like in Zoolander. It's in the computer. We've got to get it out of the systems. We can't afford to do that today. We just literally can't afford it because the cost of finding those answers, using people to find those answers, is just too great, and the time, it's just too long. By the time you could figure out the answer, the negotiation's over.
Great. So we talked about M&A due diligence, but that's really just we're not an M&A due diligence company. That was almost the beginning of a blueprint. So can you share a couple more, or maybe like one other example?
Well, and I think one of the reasons why I thought M&A diligence would be a good use case or a good proof of concept, beyond sort of the ease of getting to it, was because really what we were doing with AI agents in the M&A due diligence context was to look at a contract, summarize it, and then later take some analysis and provide us analysis like a human might be able to do. And that sort of ability is something that we need all the time in legal teams. Not only are we doing the deals that are happening today right in front of us, but a lot of times when you go back and look at our contractual relationship we have with our customers or with our suppliers or whatever, for all kinds of reasons, right? Whether it's we're trying to shore up our supply chain and fix things in the supply chain, whether it's do we have sort of force majeure clauses and what they look like, and if something were to happen, and what is our duty to perform? What does that look like? You and I talked about that once in the context of the CrowdStrike incident, where I had some questions that were very difficult to answer. But also, it's when you go back and look at your existing customers, you want to offer them a new product or sell something new to them. You want to see like how, for us, this was a use case we talked about at MasterCard. Like, what does that path look like? How do we go back to our existing customers? What can we do with them? How can we expand our offering to them? And so I think there was a time when we were at MasterCard where the team was being asked to review existing contracts and look for, summarize, categorize a particular provision around data in the contracts that we signed. I'm trying to be careful not to get into specific details, but it was around the way that we were able to use the data from the customers that was generated in the context of the contractual relationship, because we were able to use it a certain way. There was a product we could offer, we could expand into. If we weren't able to use it in a certain way, we'd have to go back to the customers, renegotiate. That would be a bit of a challenge. And so we're trying to see like what is the pathway forward here. And I think the initial instruction, the way that the team was doing this initially, was to take a bunch of lawyers. I think we were doing this in-house. Take our internal lawyers and basically lock them in a room, a sweatshop, and have them review contracts and come up with the analysis here. And this was an example of what I'm really looking for from you, where you were embedded in the organization, you were talking to people, they were telling you about tasks they have. You found out about this and ran your version. You ran the AI agent approach against what we were doing internally, and the first version of it wasn't amazing, right? It was because I think it was a challenging question, because it wasn't just summarize this thing. It was analyze, categorize, and provide some additional analysis. And so we had to sort of train the AI agent. But it was something where we got a first answer out. It wasn't the best answer. It wasn't as amazing as we'd like it to be. And we were able to refine it with the team, and over a really short period of time, come up with something, get to the point where in each individual case, we were getting answers that were better than the humans were providing. But it's not just that, it's that overall, at that point, it's much better, right? Because it's consistent. You're getting the same type of analysis every time. You're not relying on 10 different people's human views of what this says, but it's the same one every time, and we're training it to what we're asking, what ultimately the person asking the question is the way that they're thinking about it, the way they want it. And I think that's the other limiter with using humans, right? If person A, who's at the top of this question, says, or is the asker of the question, says to a group of 10 people, look at all these contracts, look at this provision, analyze it, and tell me this, they're all going to have slightly different interpretations of it. And so your answers aren't always clean. There's noise in those answers. And the great thing about AI is that you can get an answer from the AI tool, right, the AI agent, go back to the asker of the question. The asker of the question can review that answer and say, this is what I'm looking for, this is what not, here's the further refinement I need. And you refine, and then deploy, and you get a consistent answer. And that's, superior in my view to having 10 humans do it.
Absolutely. I mean, that was a really memorable use case for me too, because this concept of augmented intelligence, lawyers are actually, to your point, very subjective, and they have subtle differences and very strong views about why the subtle differences are actually much better than anyone else's version. So it was really in that iterative process where it was a big victory for us to have the feedback that we were actually outperforming the human analysis. But I think when I really looked at why, it was most of that it was starting to mirror how that human liked to do it, the one who's actually doing the work, because we were training ourselves off of their own examples, their own feedback. And I think there's something there where if you put humans at the center of this, it's not only kind of, in my view, ethically and sort of from a responsibility perspective, a better way to go about it, because these humans can enjoy their work, be kind of really elevated, but you're also going to just get better adoption and satisfaction because, let's be real, I mean, CLM is not the only example. This whole last decade of legacy legal technologies really kind of not delivered.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of friends in the legal tech space, and I really appreciate what has occurred over the last few years. And I'd like to think I'm sort of on the pioneering edge of legal ops. I really strongly believe that a really good corporate legal department or an in-house legal department needs to have operations people. And as a matter of fact, the first thing I did when I became the general counsel of Micron is I elevated the legal ops position to be on my staff at the same level as the lawyers, the same, senior director level as all the lawyers who reported to me, because I wanted to make it clear how important that was. But legal tech has its limitations, and those limitations are sort of what we discussed before, that that tech is often really well deployed in a sterile environment. But as soon as you start encountering sort of like the realities of doing the work, it becomes very hard to use that. And then what you do, and I've seen this now 3 times, you take the legal tech that works well in this one particular way, and then you implement it. And what you do is you make caveats and carve-outs and this and that and the other, and you make it so, you take your implementation and you take a tool that works well and you make it super duper complicated, right? At the way that it works for you. It becomes very, very complex and complicated and hard to use. People don't want to deal with it. You have to have super users, all these things. And it's interesting that what happens is you'll find that a lot of the lawyers start looking at the legal ops people and say, you are forcing this thing on me that doesn't actually make my life better. And you're making me change my workflow. You're making me change the way I do things. And I'm not seeing a benefit. What I'm seeing is additional burden, administrative burden from you, hoops I have to jump through, other things like that. And I'm not I don't see any value out of that. And I think that's where legal tech has done a lot of really good. But I think has become challenging. When we first implemented the CLM at Micron, I remember talking to the legal ops at the time as we were developing. We're talking about the tags that we were going to put in contracts, and they had developed like a list of tags that we were going to put in contracts, how we were going to code them. I said, okay, but the way you're thinking about it actually isn't really that useful to me. I think about it like this: these are the tags that I need, and they're like, no, we're doing these tags. So I was like, okay, well, what the hell? I don't need CLN then. It's gonna offer me any benefit with the M&A team. And I remember going back to the M&A team saying like, look, we got to put these contracts in CLM and they're gonna tag them like this, but let's keep our own little thing over here on the side so that we can actually use these contracts, use this information in a way that works for us. I think what AI does and what the AI agent approach does is it sort of obliterates all of that sort of need to score and categorize and stuff like that, these contracts, because rather than doing it up front and then getting, potentially being able to use it later, and that those use cases are, I think, tend to be a little bit illusory, right? Because you don't always know ahead of time what you're going to need to know in the future. But you can do it in real time, just like we talked about on the M&A due diligence thing. We can, we will later on come up with questions or insights we want to glean from those contracts, and they may not have been things we thought about before, but now we're thinking about them, and that could be the CrowdStrike thing. Was a great example, right? Like when we put stuff into CLM, we weren't thinking about what's our liability going to be to others and what other people's liability going to be to us if this third-party vendor went down. And so we wanted to answer that question, like CrowdStrike goes down, our systems go down. What does that mean, right? From a contractual perspective, from a legal perspective, a liability perspective. That wasn't something that was coded into the contracts when they went into CLM. And so even with a great CLM deployment, you're still not able to answer the question later that comes up that is a really, really valuable one that would be great to know over a weekend, right?
Yeah, and I think that kind of example is a good segue, because your tags are different than maybe the historical examples of what a legal operations person would logically come up with as the tags. What does that imply? And just when we really kind of step back and think about this sort of post ChatGPT revolution that we're now experiencing in the technology world, why do you think chief legal officers are and arguably should be getting kind of more directly involved in AI than they otherwise would have been in the last decade?
Well, so I mean, if you think about you and I've talked about this before, sort of what my views of the sort of the different sort of stages of the in-house legal team over time, these periods of time where there were inflection points that sort of changed the way in-house teams work. And right now we're in sort of we've been operating in sort of the post-legal ops world where people understand, most general counsels understand that, hey, we need to structure our teams. We need to be able to hold ourselves to some KPIs, measure what we're doing, hold ourselves to some sort of KPIs, show that legal delivers value. But there's a lot of limitations in that, and we talked about some of them, and we hire these amazing legal ops people who are great at putting together systems and processes, but they become limited by the technology that's available to them and the way that our teams work and the way lawyers work, right? And if we're really honest about it, you look at a lot of companies, the legal operations team and the lawyers are they butt heads, right? Because the lawyers don't want to have their workflow interrupted. They know how they want to do things. They're used to doing things a certain way. And legal ops is coming and saying, I'm trying to help you do things a better way, but they don't. It's not always a good match.
Mm-hmm.
And much great work has been done, but it's not always a great match. With this AI approach, as particularly the AI agent approach, it's the first time I think that we're really able to use technology in the same kinds of ways in our workflows that we might have used humans in the past. And that's, I think, really interesting. So you and I have talked a lot about I originally started with this concept of change management. How are we going to change our legal teams to be able to accept and use AI? And ultimately, what we've talked about, it's not change management. It's just status quo obliteration, right? It's taking the status quo and blowing it up and saying, okay, in your workflow, you've got these places where you need work to be done. What's the best tool to do that work? What's the most efficient, best way to do that work? What's going to get you the best answers, fastest, relevant, in context, all that stuff. And what we're learning more and more is that we can deploy technology to do that, but we can do it in a way that doesn't necessarily disrupt the whole workflow, right? Instead of asking outside counsel a question, you're now going to ask the brain a question that is powered by AI, that's powered by this AI agent approach that has the benefit of everything the company has ever done and learned and experienced. So I think general counsels and chief legal officers should really think about this from a perspective of making their teams better.
Mm-hmm.
I say this every day, I think, and I'll probably say it every day until the day I exit this industry. I'm not trying to use AI to make my team cheaper. I'm not trying to reduce the cost of the legal team. It will happen, maybe, but I'm not looking to reduce the cost. I'm looking to make the team better. And I'm looking to take the lawyers that work for us, the group of people that work for our legal team, and I want them to be able to do more than they've ever been able to do before. I want them to push their own capabilities. I want them to become that better business partner, the strategic partner to the organization. And the way that they can do that is by having better information that's relevant, that's in context, and that's instantly available to them.
Mm-hmm.
Because it frees up then, A, they have better information, but B, it frees up their time then to go actually think about the company and the products and what we're doing and why we're doing it and who our customers are, all of those things, where we then apply this information that we can glean from our legal work to help the company make better decisions, to move more quickly through a transaction, whatever it is. And so many of those things are measurable things. Like one of them we can talk about is time to contract, right? It's very easy to measure how much time it takes us from the time we decide to do a deal to the time the deal is closed. If we can shorten that, that's money, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reduction of that time is money. But also, not fighting over stupid stuff is also, it's a reduction in that time, but it's also an opportunity to ask yourself, am I fighting for this contract provision and I either never get it, right, which I just wasted all this time and money, or B, do I give up all these other things to get it, and then it actually doesn't matter in the way that our company works. We never enforce it, or it's not valuable, and so we give up a thing of value for something that we think is valuable today, but isn't actually valuable. And how many lawyers are able to really spend the time to understand the business so well that they can recognize what's valuable and not valuable? Most of the time, we don't have that time. So for anyone thinking about, do I stick with the status quo or I go obliterate the status quo and try to use AI? I mean, for me, I think it's a really simple answer. Your lawyers are whoever works in your legal team is going to be better. They're going to be better, faster, stronger, better business partners. You're going to be able to prove ROI, right? You're going to be able to show that the legal team isn't just a cost center, that it's not just a cost that the company has to pay, but it actually does things to create real business opportunity for the company, to find profit, find revenue for the company. That's I think why AI is game changing, it's step function changing from that perspective.
So you've talked a lot about building the first truly augmented legal team. When you think about the future, n number of years from now, I would have historically said 5 or 10, but I think at the pace that we're at, it might even be 2 or 3 at this point. But when you kind of have achieved your vision, and hopefully we've helped you achieve that vision, what does your team look like? What is the relationship with your team and not only Eudia, but also law firms and kind of the industry look like? And I'd love to just hear a little bit about kind of your prediction for the future.
So, I mean, from my perspective, I think everybody sort of shifts, right? Everybody shifts upward in terms of the sophistication stack. The people that work in our legal team are better versions of themselves, right? They're able to become that more strategic partner more of the time than they're able to do it today. They're armed with better information, more information, analysis that they weren't previously able to have, but also that they have time to think about the company from a strategic perspective and help guide the company in a really strategic way. We're still going to be working with law firms. I think those law firms will be doing things differently, and we'll be using them differently. We won't use law firms to do any sort of repeatable processes because we should be able to do those ourselves with AI. But what we really will need the law firms for is human judgment, which is really important. Negotiating deals, working across from other humans. Those are the types of things that, arguing cases in court, those types of things. We're still going to need the law firms to do that. And I think the law firms that do that are going to become higher and higher end in terms of what they're able to offer, because this whole sort of repeatable process part goes away. And law firms, I think, hopefully will be incentivized to really be on the that sharp end of everything we're trying to do, rather than grinding through contracts. And law firms, I think, will change and evolve as well. When I talk to my friends at law firms, I say, if you can figure out how to use AI more, um, you'll get more work from us than you were able to get in the past, because we couldn't afford you to do this amount of work. But if you're able to deploy AI, now we can, and you can scale in different ways, right? Today, law firms have to scale by getting people and training them and, all that kind of stuff. You'll be able to scale by buying more servers and electricity, right? And so they'll be able to, I think the ones who get it right will be able to become very adept in taking advantage of this technology quickly. But I do think, it really is a huge difference between today and the near future, long future, whatever it is. And, I like to talk about things in terms of people can really visualize and understand. And that's why I come back to this Iron Man thing, right? It's literally the difference between standing there on the ground as a human and flying around in the Iron Man suit. That is what my lawyers are going to be. They're going to be so much better versions of themselves because they're going to be augmented with the capabilities and intelligence that AI will provide them.
I love it. Well, it's a very inspiring, exciting place to end. So thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks to everyone else for tuning in.
Glad to be here. Thanks.